Kitty Colding. I'm the host of the new IPTV show Data Geniuses, where we focus on innovators and innovations in the wide world of data. Today we're talking to Ross Rubin, who is the CEO of Reticle Research. Super happy to have him here. Ross, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Kitty.
Thanks. Your background is pretty extensive, and I actually had to write it down because there was so much to go over. So I'm going to try to quickly run through it just to give everybody a sense of sort of the scope of what you've been doing over the years. For the past 5 years, Ross has been the CEO of Reticle Research, which is a data-driven advisory and consulting firm that really looks at consumer technologies and advances in emerging technologies. He's also a sought-after tech writer and has written, I don't know how many articles, and has regular columns with media companies like ZDNet, Inc. Magazine, Fast Company, CNET, Engadget, VentureBeat, and TechCrunch. And in previous incarnations, Ross has done everything from being a principal analyst at NPD Group, a lead analyst at eMarketer, a VP and Chief Research Fellow at Jupiter Research, which is how Ross and I met possibly 100 years ago or more. So obviously some great credentials in the data and research space. Did I miss anything important, Ross?
That paints a great picture of how ancient I am. So
Okay.
I think you got it all.
Great. So Ross, I'm psyched to have you here because I love your experience in so many different categories and industries of helping executives understand through data what's happening with their customers, with their competition, and with the marketplace in general. And so I'm hoping we can cover a few of those categories today in terms of how these folks are using deep analytical, empirical data for decision support and product development, things like that. One of the areas that you've done a ton of work in for lots of different reasons is in the media. And I'm interested in learning from you a little bit about how you're seeing media companies use data today. I think it's evolved quite a lot. And this trend of sort of data as content that you're seeing with media companies today.
Yeah, sure, Kitty. For the past few years, I think even before there was a renewed emphasis on fact-checking and the battle over truth in the media and partisan media outlets, there was an emphasis on the rise of data journalism. And the idea is that not only is there a narrative in media, but by bringing in relevant information, which often takes place in the form of data, you can bolster your case, you can make a richer context for your story, and reporters and other people who write have many different, can tap into many different sources for data. Some of these are publicly available, some of them are sold commercially, and some of them have created their own media, own data rather, through the ages. So a great example of that, for example, is The Economist magazine, which launched the Economist Intelligence Unit in the 1940s. So that's an early example, but today there are many examples of companies that have research arms and occasionally infuse their own content with data. A lot of these are on the business media side. Thomson Reuters, Dow Jones, Bloomberg is an excellent example. And we do a lot of work with companies that have audiences, content, media and events companies, to explore different ways to enrich their product offerings and content with research.
And is their objective, Ross, you mentioned this a moment ago, but is it simply to create more sort of credibility and depth for their content? Are there explicit revenue models that are attached to kind of this new layer of data? Is it a competitive advantage? Are they using it for sort of understanding their audiences better? What are the ways that they're using these kind of data sources?
I would say it runs the gamut, and a lot of it has to do with the editorial mission of the as it comes down to the burden of representation that the editorial party wants to assign to the data. So let me dig down a bit deeper into that. So in some cases, media companies will launch research divisions and sell access to that data. Sometimes it will be a mix of ad revenue and research sales. Sometimes it will be more of a differentiator, and in that case, I've worked with some publications that have surveyed their own audiences and their own communities because they believe that they are, there's a case to be made that they're representative of the kinds of individuals who would have high credibility weighing in on a topic. So for example, I worked with one publication that was geared very much toward smartphone enthusiasts, and we did some research regarding which brands they liked and what brands they were inclined to switch to, what operating systems they were inclined to switch to, and that was among their own audience, their own readership. On the other hand, back in the fall, I worked with The Verge, which is a Vox Media publication that covers science and technology. And in working with the team there, they felt it was important that the audience that we surveyed be nationally representative of the United States. So we went out to an external panel and we weighted that data to make sure it was representative of the US population as a whole. And we asked them a lot of different questions about how they felt about large tech ecosystem players such as Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook.
And so Ross, in your experience, in the work that you're doing, are you gathering this data for them through sort of primary research methods? Are they buying external data, marrying it with what you're doing? What are you seeing in terms of the kind of data they're acquiring and how they're acquiring it?
Again, I would say it varies project to project. So there are some projects that I'm involved in where they're looking at something very specific. Perhaps it's something attitudinal, and the most expedient way to get at that is via, say, a survey. Sometimes it's a consumer survey. Sometimes it's an executive survey to see what the potential may be for certain software as a service offering. So we might survey a community of brand marketers to see what they are thinking about in terms of brand safety, in terms of how they place their ads, or how they are marketing to the LGBTQ community, how frequently, on what occasions, what results are they seeing. And that project was a great example of a hybrid project where I worked on the executive survey side of the project, but I also had input into the consumer survey. So it was for a media company that had a large LGBTQ audience, and we brought those findings together to see where there's might be a gap analysis between what marketers are thinking and what the community and readership is saying, and that's very common in terms of trying to find these opportunities in the market.
And so, in terms of you handling and integrating with some data collection around surveys, Are they using panels? Are they creating their own panels? Are you creating panels for them? Are you surveying kind of humans broadly? Like how are you accessing and reaching the right people, particularly when your requirement is to have those individuals be, nationally representative?
So in that case, when we need a nationally representative panel, I'll typically go out to one of the major panel companies that maintains communities of people who engage in surveys. Once you get to that scale, there's a real art to panel management, and those companies have the kinds of tools needed to maintain the community and incentivize and make allowances for people who are trying to game the system.
Right.
So when you're dealing with that kind of scale, I'll typically go out to a third-party panel. As I mentioned, there will be many instances such as these brand marketers that I've worked with, or the community of smartphone enthusiasts that I've worked with, where the media company itself, a media or events company, will maintain its own panel, its own sense of community. And in that case, we'll go out to their readership. And there's been at least one instance where I've partnered very closely with an events company that has a community of early adopters, and we've done some custom research to see what they think about certain kinds of display technologies, for example. And the community, it's broader than just research. So while I work with them on the research side, they have also engaged in things such as reviews or early tests of products, or different kinds of YouTube videos, product feedback. So that's been an interesting hybrid model.
That's cool. And are they primarily using those sort of results to, for content, or are they sort of behind the scenes? Are they offering a researchy product to the manufacturers or retailers? Is there a
Yes.
connection in that case?
So in that last example, it was for a product manufacturer, and they were using some of the input for their own product marketing needs, and they were using some of the reactions that they got in terms of the more of the product reviews as part of a social advertising campaign.
So using it to shape the messaging or the content of the ads, is that the idea?
Yeah, integrating the content of those reviews into the advertising campaign.
Okay. And
Ross, I think we tend to see a lot more of that on the B2B side. So, as I mentioned, that brand marketer community, as part of those efforts, will sometimes do qualitative interviews with prominent brand marketers, and their comments will be used in papers that the technology vendor may publish, not as an endorsement, because it always remains independent research, but just to provide more flavor in terms of what the state of the market is and what the needs of the community are.
And related to that, I always want to ask you, when I talk to you about the kinds of projects that you do, what do you see that these companies, where are they missing? What are they doing wrong? What's an opportunity that they're often not capitalizing on, or that they just haven't integrated fully enough? Where do you see that drop off typically with in this case, since we're talking about media companies?
I would say that there's been a lot of great experimentation, and I think projects that I've had the pleasure of working on with a number of companies. They've been great, and I think they've been very successful in terms of fulfilling their objectives, whether it's making a case to advertisers or providing content for the publication, or in the case of an events company, an adjunct revenue stream to allow exhibitors other ways to promote their products. I would say that I think there's an opportunity, and this is probably a fundamental difference between most research companies and say most media and events companies. There's more opportunity to create an ongoing, continuous commitment to these kinds of projects, because the longer that you're looking at a topic, and with the more consistency that you're looking at a topic, the more expertise you develop, the better you get at analyzing trends around what's happening in the marketplace. Very importantly, the more historical data you're able to create. So very often when we're revisiting topics with companies that I've conducted research with, we'll sit down and we'll think about, hey, what do we want to revisit from the last time we looked at this topic and see how things have changed, versus what are some new opportunities to explore. And sometimes we'll do that on an annual basis. Sometimes we have an opportunity to split the year, as it were. So we take one survey, say in the spring, and we look at new things happening in the field. And say in the fall, we might revisit the issues we looked at last year. So I would love to see a stronger embrace of that, because that's the real opportunity to develop themes and discover trends in the marketplace.
Yeah, so that consistency so that you can be tracking and referring back and looking at how earlier predictions actually came to light, what changed. That's very interesting. Okay, so that's...
One other thing, Kitty,
Yeah.
Which is that, just to paint a fuller picture, there is often an investment in these efforts, and one thing that I have to work with our partners to show is the return on that investment, and I think for a lot of companies, a lot of them are unfamiliar with these kinds of models, with this space, and that's why we can be a great partner for them as they learn more about the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm always impressed that with the companies, the media companies you're working with, that they're doing this stuff, because it seems to me that it is not sort of typical necessarily, but yet a really interesting opportunity for them across all the different approaches and sort of business models you can really stand up as a result. So Ross, turning now to nonprofits and associations, which I know you do a lot of work with as well. What's happening there? How are those organizations thinking about data collection like this, using it, injecting it into their businesses and into their decision making?
Well, I've done a bit of work with various trade associations over the years, and the central mission very often for these organizations is to advocate on behalf of their members, whether it is very often in a public policy kind of situation, but also to often give their members a better understanding of the state of the market and what the opportunity is. And sometimes trade associations can provide foundational data, and nonprofits can provide foundational data that other parties in the market can strongly complement. So you mentioned my time at the NPD group earlier, which tracks sales data for various kinds of consumer products. I worked on the consumer technology tracking side that looked at televisions and cameras and smartphones, etc. And in the consumer technology space, there's also a very prominent trade organization now known as the Consumer Technology Association. It used to be CEA, the Consumer Electronics Association, but they recently changed their name. And they are very well known for the gigantic Consumer Electronics Show, CES, that they put on every January in Las Vegas. But another service that they provide their members is tracking of sales, and the way they do that is they have all their members contribute information about how much they have sold, and then they aggregate that information, and that gives them an idea of what the total number of, say, televisions sold in the US was over a certain time period, say a quarter or a year. And that's great foundational information for the industry to have because, particularly getting back to the point we just discussed, they've been doing this for decades, so they have great historical information, and you are able to chart the rise and fall of various kinds of technology products. So you may ask, if the members of this trade association, which included just about everyone in electronics, certainly anybody major, was getting this data about what's being sold for practically free, as a benefit of membership, how did NPD compete with that? And the way they did it was they offered a lot of information that CTA could not. So for example, NPD was able to break down sales by not only the brand that was sold, but even particular model numbers that were sold. So if I am a product manager for that same TV maker, I know how many TVs I sold, but I don't know how many TVs competitor A or competitor B sold. And using that data, I would be able to know that. So that's why the data was very valuable to the customers. But it's also a great example of how a mix of data can come together. So not surprisingly, companies in the space would use both data sets. They would do what they could to resolve them, when there was an opportunity to do so. And even beyond that, they still, even if they had perfect information about what was being sold, because in both cases they were measuring behavioral data, what people were actually doing, as opposed to what they were saying they did. They were still interested in attitudes. They were still interested in intention. They were still interested in, thoughts about what they would prefer in terms of feature trade-offs. And there are multiple ways to do that. There are statistical ways to do that. And there are, survey-based ways to do that. There are qualitative ways to do that. Focus group, there are ethnographic ways to do that, seeing as how people actually use the product in their home. And so, that's why this industry is such an interesting one to me, because there are so many different approaches to addressing so many different kinds of questions.
And with NPD's approach, were they also layering a lot of sort of analysis and comparative findings and a lot of depth in that regard as well in order to bring value to that data?
I think it depended on the deliverable. So, on one level, people purchased databases that contained raw information about what was being bought, but NPD would deliver value in other ways. I worked with a colleague to visit our clients and talk about the data. We would also be a liaison back into the company to represent what the customers were thinking about in terms of future categories that they wanted to see tracked, and how they wanted to see it tracked, and what their input was on how their products were being tracked, and how different categories should break down. But there were also reports that included deeper analysis, both from the account managers who service those clients, as well as standalone reports that delved a bit deeper into usage and other topics. And both my fellow analysts and I there, we would talk to the media quite a bit, and that was another way of us to communicate the company's perspective on the marketplace broadly.
So Ross, thinking about all the data that we were just talking about with NPD and all the transactional data, how well would you say that consumer electronics manufacturers and retailers are really taking advantage of that data, and what are they doing with it? Are they using it for product launches, for product development, for feature development? Are they using it in competitive or pricing situations? What are you seeing there?
I think most, if not all of the above of those scenarios. So it was certainly used very tactically on a week-by-week basis to see not only how competitive sales were going, but what was the impact of promotion and discounting on products. So if one company took out an ad in a circular for a retailer, what was the impact of that ad, and if another advertiser if a competitor did the same, how did that affect the performance of the products that week? It was very useful in the early days of a category to see what the demand was looking like, how consumers were taking to products, and how did demand pick up at various price points if it did move. It was helpful for segmenting products into different tiers based on the features that they had. Overall, though, I would say that many consumer electronics categories, the transactions are relatively infrequent. So if you think about how often somebody buys a television or a camera or even a smartphone, those products are perhaps at best annual purchases, as opposed to a lot of the transactions we see in the consumer packaged goods segment. Things like detergent and soap, or even in the food or garment markets, where the transactions are very frequent and highly price sensitive. So I would say that in general, those industries tend to tap into this kind of transaction data much more aggressively. But there's a lot of exciting stuff happening now beyond just the transaction, looking at the steps leading to the transaction from an IoT perspective. So, there are now data sets looking at how consumers look at different products on a shelf, which ones they pick up, how they interact with those products, how they look at competitor sets, even focus groups, which historically have been associated with qualitative information, stuff that really couldn't be quantified. We're now seeing AI-based companies looking at facial reactions to say movies or TV show pilots, and seeing what consumer reactions are and drawing inferences based on databases of thousands of different kinds of facial reactions.
That's moderately terrifying. Okay, so Ross, you've been super generous with your time, and I know we've kept you a little longer than I promised you I would, but I'm always so interested in talking with you, and I hope you'll come back and see us again on another episode of Data Geniuses. But thank you so much for your time. It was great to have you on the show.
My pleasure, Kitty. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you on the next episode of Data Geniuses.